Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we have user Freedman Patrol, hot off his epic 6-part Ask Historians post on the caning of Charles Sumner on the Senate floor, which, on top of being a very dramatic event, was also very significant in the march towards the Civil War in the United States. This is a really gripping and narrative podcast, and definitely shines as a great episode to listen to or to recommend to friends interested in the topic, which please do. Speaking of recommendations, a couple of exciting announcements. Ask Historians is now on Spotify. That's right. In addition to getting us on iTunes, your favorite podcast application or network, YouTube, and elsewhere, you can also listen to us on Spotify. So please feel free to recommend us, and please do rate and review the podcast. It's super helpful in helping others find us. Additionally, as this is the first podcast of the month, it means it's time for our monthly book giveaway. The book giveaway is open to all of our Patreon supporters, starting at $1 and up. $5 gets you 2 entries, and $10 gets you 3. The Patreon money goes towards hosting the podcasts and the expenses there too. The winner this month will get to choose from 3 books. The first is Charles Sumner and the Coming of the Civil War, which is recommended by our interviewee today, and it's exactly what this podcast is about, so no spoilers. The second book is Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, recommended by user Chocolate Pot, who is the host of our sister podcast, A Most Beguiling Accomplishment, which is focused on fashion history, and has just released another episode on morning dress. Check it out. The book she recommends describes how Marie Antoinette shaped the future of the nation, of the French nation that is, with her riding gear, her white furs, her poof hairstyles, and her intricate ballroom disguises. Marie Antoinette came to embody, gloriously and tragically, all the extravagance of the monarchy. Or, the third book with the ridiculously long title, Brand Luther, how an unheralded monk turned his small town into a center of publishing, made himself the most famous man in Europe, and started the Protestant Reformation. Recommended by user Sun Against Gold, which basically tells the same story the title does. The winner today is, drumroll please, Michael M. Congratulations, Michael. I'll be in touch with you about the book. Now sit back and enjoy the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we are lucky to be joined again by Freedman Patrol. He's here to talk to us today about the entire history of the assault of Charles Sumner on the Senate floor on May 22nd, 1856. It will give us amazing background and history of a really important moment in American history. First things first, welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here again. Thank you.
We're always delighted to have you on. So let's start at the beginning. What got you interested in history in general?
I think like a lot of people who are interested in about the middle of the 19th century, we can blame Ken Burns a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day when he first came on, it was on night by night by night consecutively. And my father watched a lot of it. And I remember getting interested, just kind of walking by, oh, that's on again. Oh, he's watching that again. This isn't how he remembers it, but I'm going to go with my version. And then many years later, I sort of drifted away from the period a little bit. I came back to it through Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing about it.
What in particular drew you to, I guess, slavery as a topic?
Well, I'm really poor at emotional self-care sometimes, because it can be very hard to read about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think anybody who studies horrible history has moments like that. Just originally, I thought I'm just going to do 19th century politics. You know, that's what I'm familiar with. It's what I'm comfortable with. And the more and more I got into it, the more I became interested first in the intersection between politics and slavery. That's what my flair is, slavery politics. That's what I'm talking about. And then it gradually became more, the politics is nice, but slavery is actually really interesting and important on its own. And I feel like I could learn a whole lot of really useful stuff here.
So can you give us an overview of what American politics was like at the time, how things looked, in order to give us an idea of why this caning was so important and so explosive at the time?
Sure. What we're looking at here in the 1850s is ever since the end of the Mexican War, there's been increasing tension in national politics over the question of slavery. specifically whether or not it can continue to expand across the nation, but just slavery in general as well. Of how can we manage this now? It seems like slavery is getting more and more intrusive and advancing more and more towards into northern states or into the West. The big concern that's going to be relevant for us today is slavery moving into Kansas. But the whole story of the decade is basically an increasing tension and concern over the question of slavery, which previously they didn't do a super great job of it, but national politics was sort of able to contain it and put it to the side. It was always something people cared a whole lot about, especially in the South, which is the slave states, of course. It's their bread and butter. But because they were becoming more concerned in making all of these gains, people become more and more concerned about it in the North. It looks like it's starting to be more of a threat to them instead of something that they, in their magnificent whiteness, could say, oh, out of sight, out of mind. It's a long ways away. Don't bother us. And what happens over the course of the first half of the decade here is you have the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which essentially drafts ordinary Northern men into catching runaway slaves. The law specifically says that if somebody thinks that that's their runaway slave over there who's gotten up into the North somehow, then they can literally point at you and say, you need to help me right now, catch that person and take them back into slavery, or you will be in legal trouble yourself, pretty serious fines and things like that. So it becomes more intrusive that way. And at the same time, you have, because of this and related reasons, one of the two parties that kept slavery off to the side and kept slavery tensions down a little bit, the Whig Party, completely collapses. It starts to fall apart in 1850, and by Sumner's time, it's defunct as a party. And it's not clear what party is going to replace them and contend with the Democrats in the future. It could be the Republicans, and we know that's how it worked out, but it could also have been the Know Nothing Party, which is a specifically anti-immigrant party. They want America for the Americans, by which they mean white men, who are also Protestants, and are probably only from, say, Great Britain. If you're English, if you're from Wales, if you're from Scotland, you're okay. If you're from Ireland, you are definitely not. If you're from continental Europe, they're not happy with you either. And both parties are trying to fill that gap that the Whigs left there for, okay, we need a new party now because not everyone's going to join the Democrats because everybody's mad at the Democrats for being so pro-slavery. Sumner is, of course, one of the Republicans.
Just a quick question for clarification before we get into Sumner specifically. So everybody was, of course, more worried that they were now complicit in slavery because of the Fugitive Slave Act, right?
Yeah.
And what particularly brought all these things to a head? I know you mentioned Kansas, but didn't slavery exist below the Mason-Dixon line? Why would things come to a head?
See, what it looks like from a northern point of view in the 1850s is that slavery is not content to stay down where we agreed it could stay. There was sort of an understanding in the North that beneath the Mason-Dixon line, which is the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, and the Ohio River, you have slavery. Above it, you do not. And then once you hit the Mississippi, Missouri can have slavery, and points below Missouri can have slavery, but nowhere else in the Louisiana Purchase can have slavery. This is the Missouri Compromise, 1820. And then in 1850, the issue becomes we have a whole bunch of new land to divvy up. And it's a really super complicated story, but it amounts to, because of the gold rush, California has so many people, they really need a state government really fast. California, as you know, is a great big long state that goes over most of the West Coast, including way down south below any presumed line we would draw across along previous precedent, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea here is, well, we would normally divide it up. That would be how it would be done. They would draw a line somewhere and that would be that. But California has all these people. They're mostly in the northern section of California, and they are strongly against having any slavery. They had a vote at their constitutional convention, and I believe it was actually unanimous or very close to it. We don't want to have a slave state. So what are you going to do? Are you going to insist that California has slavery against their will and impose it on them? Or are you going to go back on the whole sort of tacit agreement that we divvy up the West as we go between freedom and slavery? And this, plus the fate of slavery in the Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory right next door, becomes the big issue that goes on for really almost from the start of the Mexican War until late 1850 of What are we going to do about this? How is this going to be managed? And it gets to be that freedom gets to keep California. There will be no slavery there. But it's unclear what happens elsewhere. And one of the things given to the South so that they will accept a free California is the Fugitive Slave Act, which is extremely draconian and far beyond anything that had passed before, as far as obligating ordinary Northerners to participate in slavery as a direct thing where you'd actually have to like lay hands on somebody and haul them back. And then, of course, what happens from that is, since these slaveholders have this new power to go up into the North much more extensively to recover people who ran away from them, who, as Frederick Douglass used to say, stole themselves, they come up there much higher profile. They're coming after people who've been in the North for 20 years sometimes, people who are part of communities. They're doing it in a big, visible way. And helping fugitive slaves, at least a little bit, or looking the other way, not necessarily being thrilled to see them all the time, because we are dealing with people who are predominantly extremely racist. One of the most acceptable things you could do anti-slavery-wise was help them out or look the other way or give a slave catcher bad directions, things like that. So this is the most popular way you can sort of oppose slavery without making a big deal out of it, is suddenly illegal. And there are several very high-profile attempted captures and arrests and rescues that take place over the early part of the decade. Occasionally, this even leads into out shooting fights. There's a little town in Pennsylvania, Christiana, where an enslaver and a few of his friends, I believe some family members, went to recapture a few people. And they got into a shootout, which the enslaver did not make it out of alive. There's an upstate New York case where they're trying to capture a slave named Jerry. I believe it's in Syracuse. And they had the world's worst timing, because they seized Jerry. It was a very public event, and they were going to take him down, but they had to go through some procedures first to verify that it was Jerry, which, by the way, Jerry had no say in. He had no right to testify on his own behalf. And as this goes on, there's a great big anti-slavery convention meeting literally just down the road.
Uh-oh.
They're in session when news of this hits, and they immediately adjourn and say, okay, we're going to go fix this. They busted Jerry out of the jail and got him across Lake Ontario. In Boston itself, you have a few cases of them. There's one case of not a rescue per se, but a married couple, the Crafts, William and Ellen, who had escaped from slavery by... Ellen was probably directly related by blood to her mother's enslaver. Let me put it that way. Mm-hmm. And she had very pale skin. She could pass as white. And apparently she also had the type of build and facial structure where if she was dressed up as a guy, she could pass as a young man. So she and her husband hatched this plan that she was going to dress up as a young man, and he was going to pretend to be her enslaved valet, so his in the cover story. And they were literally just going to travel north as though they were a young man, his personal slave, going north for his health. Apparently, she did a good enough job of this that she was actually kind of hit on a few times on the train. But they end up in Boston, and a couple years later, the law passes and people come looking for them. So they end up fleeing Boston for England for their freedom. The symbolism of this was not lost on people in Boston. And then you have a few cases of people rescued out of courthouses, including the second only death of a U.S. Marshal, the second ever to date. It was a case of a man named Anthony Burns, who was basically the same sort of story. He'd escaped slavery. He was living in Boston, more or less peacefully and doing okay with himself. And people came up and, okay, time to take him back. And an actual mob gathered outside the courthouse and tried to storm it to free him. And they didn't quite pull it off. But in the fracas, a deputy U.S. Marshal was killed. And then there's sort of a happy ending to this, but sort of a not happy ending too, because that's how these things tend to go. Burns was taken back under great federal expense. They marched him through the streets of Boston with the militia lined up and the Marines and everything onto a revenue cutter. And of course, the people are not happy because Boston's an extremely anti-slavery city. So everything's draped in black and people are mourning and booing. And, 19th century crowds were really big into making their opinions known about this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Lots of screaming and shouting and waving fists. They march him off, and he's carried in a revenue cutter at great federal expense back down to Virginia. And a year or two later, a traveler happens to be down there and recognizes him and manages to arrange for him to be bought and brought back north to freedom legally.
Wow.
So he got out okay. But most of the people that got caught, unless someone rescued them, they were back for until they died or until 1865 or something like that.
I was going to say, so that I think really sets us up. You've given us a good picture of how and why the North was getting so worked up about this and the things that would eventually lead to the Civil War, because now they were complicit. And I'm sure Massachusetts especially, which is where Sumner was from, felt especially passionate about this because Boston was such an anti-slavery state.
Yes, that's exactly the case. It's one of those things where, I mean, it's sort of human nature. It's terrible, but it's how we are. When a horrible thing happens far away and you don't see it, and it doesn't happen where you can really feel it as though you are there, it's kind of one of those things, maybe you can try to care as best you want, but we are how we are. But when it happens in your neighborhood to someone you know, that's a really different thing. It's much more threatening. If it can happen to them, well, where's this going? And Sumner establishes himself, first off, in politics as an anti-slavery guy, and the fugitive slave law becomes one of his specific issues. He gives a lot of speeches against it, and that really raises his profile. And he gets his Senate seat in 1851. He's elected by a really unstable coalition in Massachusetts. The thing to remember at the time is this is before the 17th Amendment, so senators are elected by state legislatures. And what happens is there are not enough regular old Free Soil Party is one of the parties at the time here. This is a little bit earlier, remember. There are not enough straight-out Free Soilers or strongly anti-slavery Whigs in 1851 to elect a senator. They make a coalition with some dissident Democrats. And that coalition takes control of the state. But then Sumner has a very difficult time getting elected because basically as soon as the coalition is in charge, the Democrats decide they're not that interested anymore. A few Whigs who came along are like, well, we're not that interested either. And a bunch of Free Soilers are of the opinion, well, we should call a mulligan on this whole Senate thing because the Senate seat isn't going to be worth that much to us. We'll do better next time, and we'll do it right then. So it takes about 2 months for Sumner to actually get elected. It was a record at the time. Now, what happens here is it's 1851. Everyone in Boston is very upset about the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, part of the problem with Boston, Massachusetts, is Massachusetts is an extremely Whig state. It's one of the Whiggiest states around. But the establishment party Whigs, the big famous Whig names like Daniel Webster and all of those types of people, they are pro-compromise. They are for the Fugitive Slave Act. They may not be thrilled by it, but they're following Webster's line of essentially, this is what we have to do to preserve the country. We have to put union first. It's a bitter pill we have to swallow maybe, but it's what has to be done. Now, the ordinary people in Massachusetts are not thrilled with this at all. So it becomes one of those things where the political party is doing something that's extremely unpopular with its own constituents, and they start shopping for somewhere else to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, there's always been a group of Democrats in Massachusetts. It's not like, everyone was always a Whig. And they themselves are relatively anti-slavery because, Massachusetts, and this is just part of the culture here. And they are very keen, though, they want to reorient the state government to fix some of the ways the Whigs have rigged things so it always works out in their favor. They want a new constitution. They want to change apportionment of the legislature, that sort of thing. And in order to get that, they're willing to make a deal with some of these people who have fallen away from the Whigs, who have become part of the Free Soil Party, which is a short-lived party that developed specifically on the platform of there will be no more new slave territories. This is a cause that the Republicans take up later on. The Free Soilers many of them are dissident Whigs. They were originally called conscience Whigs, compared to the cotton Whigs. The cotton Whigs being the ones who had close financial ties, or literally were the people running the textile mills that processed all of the slave-grown cotton. Sumner liked to call them the Lords of the Loom, who were partnered with the Lords of the Lash. And Sumner comes up he's one of these conscience Whigs. He comes up with these big speeches, he's making a stir. And when it comes election time, of course, the Whigs are going to pay a price for the regular Whigs, I should say, are going to pay a price for their dealing with the Fugitive Slave Act because everybody in Massachusetts hates it. But there's not quite enough conscience Whigs or Free Soilers or dissident Democrats alone to take over the government from the establishment Whigs. It's one of those things where they can all do it together, but none of them have the votes by themselves. So there's a very controversial coalition agreement brokered whereby the Democrats get to reorient state politics how they like. They'll have their new constitution, they'll have all those things. The Free Soilers, the conscience Whigs, they get to elect a senator. And then there are various sub-agreements, but okay, this person will get this post, this person will get this other post, all the way down through the state government. Because, regular professional civil service is basically not a thing at the time. And what happens is the new legislature gets together, and already there's some people who are uneasy about the coalition on both sides. On the Democrat side, it's like, well, we're anti-slavery, but we don't really love Sumner too much because Sumner's an old-time Whig. And, this is just not our main focus. We want to fix our domestic political situation. On the more Whiggish, more free soil anti-slavery side, you have people who feel like they're being in coalition with people who are really soft on slavery, who will be subject to pressure from the national democracy to adopt a pro-slavery tone, even if they don't personally like it themselves. And then it'll be like, we got into this coalition and we compromised our own purity of purpose and our own principles for nothing. They're just going to drag them through the mud is the fear. So Sumner was originally agreed he was going to be the new senator, replacing Daniel Webster's old seat, actually. And by the time they come to run the election, it's, well, okay, we got to make this the first order of business, because if this all falls apart, then at least we have the Senate seat. But it becomes one of those things of, we don't know exactly who's voting which way because they didn't record it person by person. But there are many, many ballots, and it becomes clear that occasionally there are more ballots than there are members of the legislature. Mm-hmm. So somebody was cheating. You get strange situations where people just don't show up for the vote for a while, where they try to change the method of voting so people have to go personally on the record, or where they change it back to where it's all supposed to be the yays and nays, but you all say them at once, and somebody's going to get a sense of the room, and that'll be the vote. They're basically trying to lawyer this out so they can somehow deny Sumner the seat and give it to maybe somebody else down the road. And there's even a school of thought of, well, we'll just leave it vacant. There'll be new legislative elections in a year or two, and we'll do it then. Fooling around like this, by the way, is one of the reasons we don't elect senators like this anymore, because sometimes seats would be vacant for months on end. Part of the difficulty is you need a straight majority. So Sumner always had a plurality of the vote, but he couldn't get quite past the threshold a lot of times. And this actually becomes a little bit tortuous for him because, he's watching this very closely, even though officially he's not paying any attention. Because the style of the time is, well, the office will find me. If I am called, I will serve. So over the course of a few months, he has these nail-biting moments, I believe twice before he's actually officially elected. Young Henry Adams, later the author, was at the legislature observing things so he could bring news to his father's house. His father is Charles Adams, who is sort of a friend of Sumner's. Mm-hmm. And Charles Adams's father is John Quincy Adams, whose father is John Adams. They're these Adamses. once or twice, he thinks it's done, and he runs home, and Sumner's there waiting. He's like, hey, you're elected, you're elected, you're elected. Oh, that's good, great, yeah. And then they immediately somewhere back, oh, wait, we're not quite there yet. Sorry. But finally it does happen. He is elected, and he goes into the Senate. The problem being that Sumner is basically a man without a party at this point. He has maybe one or two colleagues, so as far as politically, he's not going to accomplish a whole lot in the Senate. They're not going to take up the bill of a party of two people and be like, oh yeah, that's great, we'll just pass that right away. So he sees his main role in the Senate as being giving big, rousing anti-slavery speeches to help the cause. Fortunately, it's something he's fairly good at least by period standards. If you read them now, he's sort of a wooden, showy, over-eloquent, tedious writer. He distinguished himself in part by he understood the theater of giving the speeches. If you ever read like 19th century political speeches, they don't read like anything people would actually say. Mm-hmm. Because they were written in advance and basically intended to be read. And then they would be published in pamphlet form, and the politician would make a lot of money selling them.
Right.
And most people would just stand up in the Senate or wherever they were and read from the page. Sumner did not do this. Sumner memorized every speech he gave. Wow. And he practiced it. He drilled the expressions, the gestures, the tone of voice. He was an actor, He wouldn't say that, but he was acting. He was putting on a performance. So when Sumner unwound and got ready to give a big speech, it became an event. In a time when politics was already strongly overlapping with entertainment, people would literally go to see politicians tear into each other for the fun of it, as well as because of policy. Sumner was kind of made for the environment. He wouldn't just give you the good rhetoric. If you could get into the Senate gallery, you could see him there eloquently declaiming on this and that, and he would memorize his speeches, even with long passages of statistics in them. Lots of names and dates and classical allusions and untranslated Latin quotes. This was the kind of guy he was. And he's in the Senate, and almost as soon as he's in the Senate, his coalition is falling apart back home. Now, Sumner is there for 6 years. That's how the Constitution has it. He's there through 1857, unless he, for some reason, has to resign first. So he is shortly left completely unmoored. Well, my coalition's no longer in power back home. I'm probably not going to get reelected again. Mm-hmm. So it becomes more and more urgent for him that he's able to deliver these big speeches, become visible in national politics, up his personal profile. So maybe he can go in as sort of, he would say he could be a man without a party. He doesn't need these stinking parties conniving to get him elected. He totally does. He will work through his star power. He will make himself the great man of Massachusetts. And they'll be proud to bring him back instead of putting up some grasping little politician in his place. And over the course of the first few years in there, he makes many speeches about this and that. He does not mainly take part in debates. He very rarely speaks extemporaneously because he likes to do all his preparation. He would rather do the great big speeches. He occasionally has a quick wit when he does get into actual arguing with people, but it's pretty rare. And he's not too unusual in that. If you ever go and read the Congressional Globe, an experiment I don't recommend unless you have a strong tolerance for boredom, you will be able to tell where they'll have these long speeches that go on columns and columns and pages, eloquent, full of citations and everything. Sumner, being a known classicist, was occasionally asked to check the Latin in other people's speeches. And then there'll be like a brief exchange, and suddenly they're talking much more like normal people. And then they'll be right back to the great big giant paragraphs. And there is a certain charm to it, but that may be Stockholm Syndrome on my part speaking.
What's the big speech that finally gets him in this whole heap of trouble that ends up in getting him caned?
Well, that happens over the fate of slavery in Kansas. Now, Kansas was supposed to not have slavery, per the Missouri Compromise. It's north of Missouri's southern border, and it's not Missouri itself. So by law, from 1820 onward, absolutely no slavery there. It's banned. a priori, if you organize that and open it to white people and force the Indians out or murder them or all the other horrible things we did to Native Americans, then you can't have slavery there. That'd be just like, the Northwest Ordinance did. No slavery there. It's all agreed in advance, and this becomes like a settled part of the political landscape. We're just not touching this again. We settled that in the 1820s. Why would we reopen this horrible box and make a terrible affair of it again? And for the reasons why we did that, you can listen to my previous episode on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But for right now, the important thing is that it was done in kind of a shady way, but the Missouri Compromise was repealed, which now meant that the status of slavery in Kansas was question mark. And it was going to be decided by the actual white men who went there, colonized it, and voted. Of course, then you immediately get into, well, effective immediately when the territory is open to white settlement, can we bring slaves there or not? Is that legal? If you happen to live in Missouri, which had its most enslaved region, growing hemp mostly, right up against the Kansas border, the answer is absolutely yes. Slavery is legal here until an affirmative law is passed ending it. If you're not from the South, then you probably believe, and this is to use a phrase Sumner coined, freedom national is the presumption. You probably believe that to institute slavery requires a positive law. The legislature somewhere has to pass a law saying, okay, slavery exists here, here are the rules for slavery. The two presumptions Sumner would distinguish between are the northern one, the anti-slavery one, a freedom national, slavery sectional, where freedom is the default. And the southern presumption that slavery is national and freedom is sectional, whereby this is basically the southern default. And because Kansas is such a high-profile thing, and its future is literally up in the air and can be decided on the ground, everyone gets really interested in it. And in short order, Kansas turns into a real hot mess.
Mm-hmm.
By the time Sumner is speaking, in May of 1856, Kansas has 2 territorial governments, has 2 constitutions. And what has happened here is it has 2 of them not because the people of Kansas are fanatical anti-slavery people who are just really committed to it. Some of them are, but most of them are not. But because the people from Missouri, who had no intention of going to Kansas anytime soon or ever, came over in vast numbers every time Kansas held an election. And they came over with their friends who we're going to call Mr. Whiskey, Mr. Bowie Knife, Mr. Rifle, and Mr. Freaking Cannon. I am not kidding. There were actual cannons involved. They came over. It's a little bit insane. They came over, and of course, you know how the elections went once they showed up. Well, I do not believe that you are a resident of Kansas. By what right do you claim to vote? The election workers would say. And the people coming up to vote from Missouri would say, have you met my friend, Mr. Rifle? Have you met my friend, Mr. Bowie Knife? How about Mr. Cannon? I have lots of friends. How many friends do you have? And it occasionally, well, there's one instance of it literally coming to the point of they're holding the election, they're running the polls in a cabin, and you would come up to the window to vote. And a guy who later becomes a sheriff in Kansas walks up to the window and he says, I understand you're giving people problems if they want to vote. You're saying they're not from Kansas. Well, you're going to let them vote. And the election workers sort of say, well, it says under the rules here, we can only let them vote if they swear an oath that they are legally entitled to vote. And then they're under penalty of perjury if they lied. And he basically says, you're not going to swear anybody to any oaths. That's not going to happen. Now, wait a minute here. These are the rules. I understand you've got a lot of friends. We've met your friends. But look, the rules are the rules. This is a democracy here. This is what civilized white men do. And the future sheriff, Samuel Jones, basically steps back and he sort of gives his friends over to the sides a little wave. And they stick long logs under the corners of the house and start levering it up, trying to bring it down. They're really trying to bring the roof down on the poll workers. And when that doesn't seem to quite be working too well, I guess it was a pretty well-made cabin, he and a few of his friends burst through the door, guns drawn, And he says, all right, you have 5 minutes. You are going to resign your judgeship over this election, or we are going to shoot you dead here now. And the election workers say, well, that's an interesting proposition you have there, Sam. Can we have these 5 minutes to think it over? Well, I'm a civilized man. You can have 5 minutes. And they take 5 minutes. They're kind of talking it over. They're not really sure what's the best course of action here because they don't want to get shot. They finally decide what they're going to do as well. Can we have another minute or so? Well, all right, you can have another minute. And he's basically got his gun out on them at this point, waiting. And he's here with several friends who are also armed. They're all in the cabin together with these poor people. Unsurprisingly, they decided they were not going to make an issue out of it, and they quietly resigned. You have to understand that, like many people, they had an allergy to being shot. And scenes like this play out every time Kansas tries to have an election. It's so extreme that when even the local Kansans have a pro-slavery party who has candidates they want to elect to their legislature, the guys from Missouri come in and they say, nope, we don't trust your guy. We're going to have our own guy who we know for sure is pro-slavery. He's going to run in this spot, and your guy has to stand aside. Self-determination, not a super high value for these people. One of the ringleaders of this is a sitting United States Senator, David Rice Atchison, who loudly proclaims when he comes over into Kansas that if they have to, they will kill every goddamned abolitionist in the state. Or into territory, excuse me. If it takes 1,000 men, it'll take 1,000 men. If it takes 5,000 men, we've got them in Missouri, we'll bring them over. It's going to happen. Naturally, the legislature is super stacked with pro-slavery people. There is a limited attempt to do a few do-overs about a year before Sumner gets caned, but what happens when the legislature actually meets is they still have a pro-slavery majority, and the majority votes that they're going to not take the people who won the do-over elections. They're going to recognize the original winners and expel the other people. And Kansas promptly, once this is done, starts passing a very draconian slave code, which does everything it possibly can to outlaw being anti-slavery in Kansas. If you are anti-slavery, you cannot publish on the fact. You cannot give public speeches. You cannot become an officer of the court. You cannot serve on a jury. You cannot take any state office. You are completely shut out of political life in Kansas unless you are willing to affirm slavery. Now, like I said, most of the people in Kansas, maybe even many of the people who are anti-slavery, do not necessarily have it as their primary reason for being there. But once this becomes such an imposition on them, it becomes what they understand as a threat to Republican government, to their own personal rights. They're being dictated to through these elections conducted with massive voter fraud, and everything's been set up in this extremely draconian way that just, it doesn't even feel like, this is not America. This is not what we signed up for. They begin to gravitate over to the idea that, well, you know what? This government might have been set up by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It might be endorsed by the President of the United States. It might have a governor named by him, as territories generally did. But it's not, in any meaningful sense of the word, legitimate. It's not our government. It's not a government based on white male consent. And that's what America's all about. So they're going to throw their own government. And they're not going to recognize these territorial laws. Naturally, things heat up in Kansas pretty quickly. So Sumner is going to give a great big speech on what's happening in Kansas. And the official cause for the speech is that both of the Kansas territorial governments have sent constitutions and senators out to, well, delegates, I should say, delegates, out to Washington, and both of them are saying, hey, I'm the government of Kansas. Can I be a state? I have a constitution. I got the signatures. I've been elected to come here and do this. Congress, state me. And Congress is like, well, we know what party we want to vote for because, you know, we know whether or not we're anti-slavery. Right. But things are clearly off kilter in Kansas. Something weird has really gone down there. So the House of Representatives dispatches a committee to actually go to Kansas, take testimony, and investigate, which is lovely of them because it's a beautiful primary source collection. But while they're doing their work, the issue is still before the Senate and still before the House. What are we going to do about this? And Sumner believes, of course, you should recognize the free state government. and you should not recognize the other government. All the other solutions that have been proposed for this are terrible ideas. Free state statehood immediately. That's the program. If you can't get with that, you're just choosing terrible options. You're either overruling democracy, you're risking civil war, or you're even trying to get people killed on the ground there by telling them that they have to disarm in the face of heavily armed and aggressive enemies. So he goes into the library. He does a lot of research on this. Sumner's kind of a research monster. It's one of the things that's kind of endearing about him for, the type of person who likes to study this sort of thing, or so I'm told. He's going to come up in there. He's going to give a great big speech. And that means he has to do a lot of research. He goes to the Library of Congress. He gets out books. He does all the normal things. And Monday, May 19th, 1856 is the day. Everybody knows it's coming. He's had it written. He's done the research. He's been practicing it by himself in his boarding house. There is an urban legend about this. If you can call anything 19th century an urban legend, it's sort of a story that went around, There's a story that Sumner practiced at night, and he hired a black boy to hold a mirror so he could watch himself. There is no truth to this, but it's one of those things you often hear because it was repeated so many times by his enemies. Yeah, the great humanitarian hired some poor black kid to listen to all this and hold up the mirror and so Sumner could see himself being awesome. Yeah, great guy. But it's untrue. And he did a dry run with his colleague, William Seward. Seward tells him, well, it's a good speech. Maybe you should tone it down just a notch. Charles Sumner does not tone things down any notches. So he gets up Monday afternoon, takes the floor in the Senate, and he runs down the whole situation at great length. And I do mean great length. The published pamphlet version of the speech, which will be relevant in a few moments, is 33 pages of small type double column. The version in Sumner's complete works, single column, is more than 100 pages. It's a long speech, and I've read every word of it, I swear. Most of it many times.
I believe you.
It's not the most enticing reading. So he lays out the situation here. All of your other suggestions are terrible ideas. The only thing you can do to fix things, admit Kansas immediately as a free state, call it done. In the course of his speech, though, he says that he needs to, instead of just confining himself to the facts, he needs to talk about the previous debate in the Senate. You see, what's happened here is, well, actually, let me read you the quote. I have it right here. Before entering upon the argument, I must say something of a general character, particularly in response to what has fallen from senators who have raised themselves to eminence on this floor in championship of human wrongs. I mean the senator from South Carolina, by this he means Andrew Pickens Butler, who literally sat next to him at the time. He and Sumner were friends, and Butler was one of the people who would go to Sumner to have his Latin checked out for him. And also the senator from Illinois. This is Stephen Douglas, who masterminded the whole Kansas-Nebraska Act passage. And he describes them together. Who, though unlike as Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, yet, like this couple, sally forth together in the same cause. And he says a lot of things about Douglas that aren't super important right now. The ones that are important are the ones about Butler. Butler is a senator from South Carolina, which is the most slavingest state in the nation. It's the center of pro-slavery extremism. Butler has already said in the Senate that he believes the Union is basically kaput, and it's a matter of time before secession happens. He's one of these guys. Now, Sumner describes Butler saying that he has read many books of chivalry and believes himself a chivalrous knight with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery. You might be able to see where Seward told him to take it down a notch. Now, what Sumner is doing here is he is making a general argument this is a bad cause, that you've adopted it for bad reasons, and you're a bit of a fool for adopting it. But he didn't go to harlot just as like a random word choice. He didn't do it to make the analogy fit. He's hinting at sexual depravity because this is a major theme in abolitionist discourse. Slavery is a threat to the moral values of white men because it gives them all of these opportunities to sexually exploit enslaved women, often violently, always by threat. And the way it works is, it's such an established thing in the South. It may not have literally been, as anti-slavery people often said, the whole section was a great brothel, but it was an established custom to the point where you had people marketed, women, as quote-unquote fancy slaves who are specifically sold for their looks and their desirability sexually. Yeah, that's a thing. And it's something that Southerners occasionally mention themselves. There's a passage in Mary Chestnut's Civil War diary where she talks about, we're like the patriarchs of old. There's a wife, and then there's the concubines. And every woman knows the parentage of all these rather pale enslaved children, except for the ones that look like her own husband or her own sons. So the thing here is this is a really low blow, but it's also one they can't completely deny because they talk about themselves so much. At times it is even deployed as a defense of slavery. I swear I'm not making this up. They publish pamphlets arguing that, rape is a terrible thing, but rape of a white woman is a much worse thing than rape of a black woman. So slavery is preserving white women from this. Isn't this wonderful? I wish I could unread some of that stuff, but it's literally what they said.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically rounds out the first day of Sumner's speech. He's up there for about 3 hours this time. If you ever read it, you'll feel all 3 hours and then some. The next day, he comes back and he takes more swipes at Butler. Butler is not present in the room. He's not even in town at the moment. He's down in South Carolina. And Butler had taken part previously in the debate, though, and Sumner characterizes his participation there in a way that's really hitting below the belt, even by modern standards. And I don't want to torture you with quotes, but I think this is kind of important to understand exactly what was said. Omnipresent in this debate, overflowed with rage at the simple suggestion that Kansas had applied for admission as a state, and, with incoherent phrases, discharged the loose expectoration of his speech. The senator touches nothing which he does not disfigure with air, sometimes of principle, sometimes of fact. He shows an incapacity of accuracy, whether in stating the Constitution or in stating law. He cannot open his mouth, but out there flies a blunder. Okay, that's kind of nasty. Even on itself, that's not a really friendly thing to say.
Yeah.
But by the same token, political debate gets pretty heated. The problem here is that Andrew Butler has a few problems that make this much more hurtful. Specifically, he suffers from some partial facial paralysis.
Mm-hmm.
So he might also have been transported by rage. He might also have been so fed up that he was not completely coherent. But if he was slobbery, if he had a speech impediment, that's not his fault. His face doesn't all work like it should, so sometimes he says it and sprays it. This is not something you should make fun of people for. And from that, then, Sumner goes on to the other prong of his attack that becomes relevant in a moment. He accuses South Carolina, the state, of what he calls imbecility during the Revolution, because they were so wrapped up in preserving slavery that it compromised their fight against the British. So that's a kind of a 1-2 punch there, because he's impugning Butler, and he's also impugning Butler's state. And while he's saying all this over 2 days, Stephen Douglas is in the back of the Senate chamber. He's pacing there. He's kind of fed up with all this. And he supposedly grumbles to himself, although take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because the account is from a decade after the fact, when we all know how things went out. Douglas supposedly says, "That damned fool will get himself killed by some other damned fool." Now, Douglas is personally invested here, so maybe he's not an objective observer, even if he did say it for sure. But the thing is, there are lots of people packing the galleries watching this speech. Sumner gives a speech, it's a big event. And they include congressmen and, other people from around Washington. And some of the congressmen from Massachusetts, getting a sense of the room, are getting the same idea. Sumner's going to get himself shot. You have to remember Washington, D.C. is a southern city. It itself has slavery. It is surrounded by 2 slave states. It is the site of a major slave market until 1850, at which point the market moves across the river to Alexandria. It is not incidentally involved in slavery. So there are a lot of people around here who could take offense at this kind of attack on slavery. And one of the congressmen who has this feeling goes up to Sumner's Massachusetts colleague, the other senator now, Henry Wilson. Wilson is also the fellow who masterminded the coalition that got Sumner elected in the first place. And he says to Wilson, hey, this is bad news. Sumner's going to get himself shot. And Wilson's like, you think so? He's like, yeah, really? This is serious stuff. So Sumner finishes his speech on the second day, Tuesday the 20th. And Wilson comes up to me and says, hey, Chuck, I'm going home with you today. In fact, a bunch of us are going home with you today, just, to be safe. And Sumner kind of gives him a dirty look, and he's like, none of that. No, we're not doing that. But he's still sitting at his desk, so Wilson gets a, well, I'm just going to get the guys together, and when he leaves, we'll go with him. It's not like he's going to chase us off the stick. And Wilson goes, and Sumner promptly ditches him. He shoots out, in his own words, and he passes Seward on the way out, and Seward's like, hey, you want to share a wagon? We got a dinner date later. And Sumner says, no, I can't do it. What I got to do is I got to go down to the printer, and I have to check out the pamphlet version of my speech, make sure the printer didn't screw anything up, because they're going to be printing up a whole lot of those, and I'm going to be sending them in the mail and everything. And he does not want to be misquoted. So that day, he goes home. It's fine. What Sumner doesn't know, and what Wilson and the congressman only had a sense that might happen, is that one of the people who was watching Sumner on the first day is a fellow named Preston Brooks. Brooks is a congressman from South Carolina. He's also related to Andrew Butler. And Brooks is just fuming at this. Now, it's important to understand the thing about Brooks, though. Brooks is not the most pro-slavery man around. He's not a radical. He is from South Carolina, so he's more extreme than usual for a Southern politician. But he's not at the extreme edge. He is completely obscure. I don't think there's ever been a biography. I've looked. And his main claim to fame before this, aside from he did some things in the Mexican War, is he proposed that congressmen should maybe check their guns when they come into the House of Representatives. Check them, leave them in the cloakroom, just so no one gets shot, just throwing that out there.
Valid.
He's 36. He's 36. He's younger than Sumner, but not super young. He's not a child, just really worked up. He's a grown man. And he decides that Sumner's remarks are an insult twice over, against Butler, his kinsman, and against South Carolina, the state he loves. They impugn the honor of the state and the senator. And to just leave that be would be the same as agreeing that it's true, as far as Brooks is concerned, and as far as is concerned with the predominant Moors in the South. So what he needs to do is what was called resenting it. Now, by resentment, we usually mean, I'm going to grumble about this a little bit, I'm going to think bad things. Maybe I'll be a little bit of a jerk for a while. We're carrying a grudge. When Brooks says resent it, he means a real plan of action. Somehow, Sumner needs to pay. And it becomes an issue of, how is Sumner going to pay? What's going to happen here? And he sits and he fumes on it. And the next morning, Wednesday the 21st, a congressman from Virginia, Henry Edmondson, is coming into the Capitol for his day's work. He sees Brooks hanging around outside the Capitol building. And he kind of looks at it and says, I know what's going on here. You're waiting for Sumner, aren't you? And Brooks says, well, yeah, you got me. And they sit down and talk things over a little bit. Now, Edmondson understands what's potentially going to happen here. He gets the code that, Brooks might be doing something physically violent to Sumner. And they discuss things. And Brooks is of the attitude, what would be really nice? I could use a witness for whatever happens. Will you kind of be my witness? And Edmondson's like, well, yeah, sure, okay. And if Sumner happens to come accompanied by a bunch of friends, I mean, I don't really want you to get into it, but if he has his friends around him, could you maybe step in a little bit? And Edmondson's like, well, okay. But for the record, are you thinking you're going to just call him out verbally and ask for an apology? And what's door number 2 when Sumner says no? Because Sumner's going to say no. Charles Sumner is not good at apologies, even if he thinks they're owed. Well, there's going to have to be some kind of punishment then, isn't there? They sit down together and they wait for Sumner. It gets to a little bit past noontime and they give up on the presumption, well, he didn't come this way, he must have gone to the building some other way. Darn it. And the day passes, and that night, Brooks is still nursing his grudge. He meets 2 other South Carolinians, Lawrence Kite and James Orr. Kite will be coming back, Orr is not super important. He meets them around 10 o'clock at night, and he basically tells them that he's going to do something about Sumner. It's not clear how much he tells them, only in the sense that he has some purpose. He's going to go to Sumner, and something might happen. The Sumner affair will go from meeting him until question mark, and question mark can be, probably something violent. Now we're at Thursday, May 22nd, 1856.
The day of the deed.
The day of, yes. Edmondson's walking into the Capitol again, and there's Brooks. This time he's at the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance, which is, I guess, where there's a nice gatehouse. He sees Brooks loitering there, and he's like, you're looking out for Sumner again, aren't you? Yep. Haven't even slept the night before. It's been burning him up so bad. Got to do something. I mean, it's been days now. It's starting to look like an acceptance almost if he doesn't act soon. And this way, Brooks figures if Sumner comes by carriage, he's going to get out of the carriage about here. If he comes by foot, he's probably going to come this way. This is like the main entrance or something. And Edmonds says, well, wait a minute. What happens if Sumner comes in and he gets past you and you don't get a chance to confront him right away? And Brooks says, well, I'll chase him through the Capitol. And Edmondson says, hey, dude, think about this a little bit. You're going to chase him through the Capitol, a big building, up a bunch of steps. And have you noticed that Sumner is over 6 feet tall? He's a very healthy, big dude. He is larger than you are. He may decide to put his boot far into an uncomfortable place. And you would approach him winded, tired, and then basically invite him to do something. This is a fight you might lose badly. So he's literally giving Brooks tips. And Brooks says, well, you have a point there. He would rather not have a shoe leather colonoscopy, I guess. They sit around for a little bit, but eventually they go into the building. And they part company with Edmondson's going off to the House, and Brooks goes straight for the Senate. Edmondson gets to the House. He finds out that a Missourian congressman has just died. So as is traditional, the House is going to adjourn immediately. So he's cut loose for the day. He decides he's going to go over and check up on Brooks, see how things are going. And he goes across the Capitol building, and there he runs into Kite. Remember Kite from the late night meeting?
Mm-hmm.
And he says to Kite, hey Larry, you want to go down the street somewhere? Maybe we can get a meal or whatever. And Kite says, no, I cannot leave till Brooks does. This is the point where the dramatic music plays, dum dum dum. Now, because this Congressman Miller from Missouri has died, the House is already adjourned. The news of that goes to the Senate. And immediately one of the Missourian senators gets up, a guy named Geyer, and he gives like a brief little eulogy for Congressman Murray, and then the Senate also adjourns. This is all a very traditional, customary thing they just do. That doesn't mean everyone leaves, though, because at the time, congressmen have no private offices. They have basically no staffs. They do most of their work at their desks in the chamber. So Sumner's going to be around for a little while. Edmondson walks past Kite, comes into the Senate chamber, and sees Brooks sitting in a lobby there. He's sort of opposite from where Sumner is sitting. And Henry Wilson filters out. He sees Brooks. He recognizes him from somewhere around, gives him a little bow, passes on. Nothing happens. Brooks is sitting there stewing, looking at Sumner. Sumner is, you can't make this up. It's like the perfect symbolic moment. Sumner is sitting at his desk, which is piled high with copies of The Crime Against Kansas, his big offending speech, in pamphlet form. He's franking them to send out to admirers. And Sumner is nearsighted, but he will not wear glasses because he's a little bit vain about this sort of thing. So he's really buried in his work. He's got his nose right down there writing his name on these pamphlets to put them in the mail. And he gets a little bit annoyed. People keep coming up to him. Hey, Chuck, you want to go do something? You want to have a talk? No, I've got mail to do. Leave me alone. Jeez. So, while all of this is going on, Brooks is sitting there stewing. Edmondson walks up to him. And he's like, well, I guess it's go time. But there's ladies in the gallery still. And Brooks is a gentleman. He doesn't want to expose ladies to the violence he might be doing. Or for that matter, probably to some of the language he might be thinking of using. So he tells Edmondson, well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to send for Sumner. I'm going to send him a note, and he'll come out, and then we'll do whatever we're going to do. And Edmondson says, look, Preston, you're not thinking this through again. You send Sumner a note to come, he's going to send a note back to you. It says, well, get your butt in here. Because he's busy. He just waved off his buddies. You think he's going to wave you off? And so there he is at his desk, and what's happening here is Brooks is like, well, gosh, you're right. That's kind of a bad deal. And Edmondson says, well, why don't I go ask somebody who knows about proprieties? Like, if something does happen on the Senate floor, in the chamber, is that going to be okay, or would that be kind of a party foul? So Edmondson finds a senator from Arkansas, a guy named Johnson, who is at that point exiting the chamber, and Edmondson sidles up to him and asks, strictly hypothetically, what would happen if, say, would there be any impropriety? Should there be some kind of altercation, say, between, oh, I'm just pulling these people out at random, Mr. Brooks and Mr. Sumner, if, say, it happened to take place in this Senate chamber that we were just walking out of, which coincidentally has just adjourned? You know, he's not thinking of anything in particular. It's just a hypothetical question. Johnson thinks it over. He's like, well, the Senate is adjourned. It's not really packed anymore. This is the scene of the crime, basically. So that seems like kind of the proper place to do it. And honestly, doing it in the Senate floor might be a little bit better, a little bit cleaner, because if it happens on the street somewhere, it might devolve into a street brawl. You know, Sumner has friends, Brooks has friends, and things go on. They're talking this over. Edmondson maintains, when he testifies later on, he didn't know what was coming up next. He's asking entirely, you know, in principle, something might happen. But he doesn't have affirmative knowledge that something's going to happen.
Right.
Well, as they're chatting this out, what happens next happens over the course of about a minute and a half to 2 minutes, but there's a lot going on. Brooks is back in the chamber. He's been sitting there. And the last of the ladies that he's been waiting on files out of the chamber. Okay, it's go time now, for sure. He's not going to miss his opportunity now. Sumner's still bent over his franking. He's been waving people away, but he's gotten into the zone now. He's really zooming through it. And I think we've all been there, you know, you just get into the mood and you're really cranking away. So, Sumner's bent over, and he hears a voice, someone in front of him. They say, well, I guess he didn't even look up until he heard his name, because, you know, people move around. And Brooks says to Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. He literally read it in the pamphlet I mentioned. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine. And he breaks off there. Brooks maintains he finished a sentence and gave Sumner a moment, but nobody believes him. Sumner maintained that Brooks basically broke off, and he raised up his gutta percha cane, a walking stick with a nice gold handle on it. He held it by the gold end, for the record, and he started wailing on Sumner's skull. Now, this is not a 2x4, but it is a pretty sturdy cane. It's got a little spring to it. So when it hits a solid object, it's really going to whip. If you're ever in Massachusetts, you can go see it at the Old State House Museum. And we don't know exactly how big it was, but it was a pretty good sized thing. It was a grown man's walking stick. They were a very common fashion accessory at the time, so the fact that he had one would not have raised any alarms for anybody. So now what happens next is Brooks opens up on Sumner. And Sumner immediately tries to shield himself because, he's getting beaten over the head. What else would you do? He throws his arms up, and the problem is he's pinned into his desk. He's scooted up really close, and the desk is bolted into the floor. So he can't just rise up and throw his arms up to knock the cane away. Brooks is pounding down basically on a trapped man. And Sumner's a big dude, but, you can be a big dude and have a problem when people are cracking a cane over your skull. That's just how brains work.
Yeah.
So Brooks is pounding on him. Sumner, from the first blow, says he's basically struck blind. He doesn't know what's going on anymore. He's just feeling the blows and trying to deflect them with his arms and trying to get up out of the chair. And what actually happens is he heaves up and he pulls the desk out of the floor, knocks it over, and he's staggering. He's already covered with blood. His head's been laid open in at least 2 places, one of them all the way to the bone. And Brooks is wailing on him and wailing on him. And he staggers. He falls half down. He's in a crouch. Brooks grabs him by the collar to hold him up so he can get beating him more. And according to one of the observers, Robert Toombs, senator from Georgia, who later said that he approved of the assault. He didn't approve it in the sense that he knew ahead of time, but he approved of it and that he thought, well, that was a great thing. Glad I saw that. Toombs says that now that Brooks had that extra space at play, he could really lay in with the cane. And he was just banging it on Sumner's skull, and the thing actually broke. Wow. The cane snapped in half. Part of it recoiled and put a little cut in Brooks's forehead. That's how hard he's hitting the thing. Now, I don't know about you, but if it were me, I think at that point I'd probably be satisfied. Brooks had not had enough. He kept going. He kept at it until a congressman who'd come in, drawn by the noise basically, saw what was happening and came up, charged him, grabbed him, and wrestled him back from Sumner. And he was energetically trying to fight that guy off and get back to beating on Sumner until a senator from Kentucky, a guy named Crittenden, comes up and says, "Don't kill the man," and kind of puts a hand on him. And then Brooks says something to the effect, "Well, I didn't want to kill him. I was just going to give him a good flogging." And it's unclear whether or not Brooks was telling the truth there. He claimed later on that when he saw Sumner rising, he panicked. And he started, he originally intended to just give a few smart whacks. Maybe it'd be like a symbolic thing. But then in his private letters, he ends up bragging about it. "Yeah, I laid on 30 good whacks. Every one of them went exactly where I wanted to." So do you believe him speaking in public? Do you believe him speaking in private? I'm inclined to think that he intended to do serious harm to Sumner, but probably not as serious as he ended up doing. He may have lost control of himself in the moment. Mm-hmm. Once these things get going, they have a momentum of their own. So he's wrestled away from Sumner, and Sumner is spirited away to, he's actually caught as he's falling. And because Sumner's such a big dude, the congressman who comes up to catch him can't actually catch him and do it safely. So they kind of end up a controlled crash. He's soaked through with blood. Blood all the way through his coat, down to the inside. Blood all the way through his shirt, through his vest, everywhere. Blood down into his pants. And they take him, they get a doctor, and they eventually escort him back to his boarding house to be treated. So that's the event itself. Now, what happens, though, is almost immediately this becomes an issue of there are very different reactions to this in different parts of the country.
Right. So let's go there. Sumner, of course, is laying in the hospital or trying to recover. What are the reactions?
Yeah. What happens almost immediately is there is a sense in the South that, number one, this isn't really a serious deal. This is just a private affair. There was a private insult. It was avenged. We're done. In the North, this is barbarism. This is an attack upon our democracy. It doesn't matter what his politics are or what he was saying. This is not how you treat a senator of the United States. For words he said in debate in the Senate, you do not treat a person like this. The privilege of untrammeled debate must be maintained if we are going to have a free government. If you allow this to persist, if you allow this precedent to stand, then what happens is you have a chilling effect on debate. Senators realize they might get beaten up too, so they can't really speak their minds. They can't serve their constituents like they're supposed to. and you're knuckling under to this horrific bullying and violence, it's no way to run a country. And Southerners are of the opinion, this is a great way to run a country. Brooks gets deluged with admiring letters, newspaper editorials praising him, advising others to take up his example, saying he should go back and do some more. He gets all kinds of new canes in the mail. He's invited to come speak everywhere. It's a tremendous, beautiful reception. Everyone loves him all of a sudden. There are very few dissenting voices in the South about this. And contrariwise, there are very few dissenting voices in the North on how outrageous this is. Sumner himself is badly injured. It does not appear so at first. His doctor thinks, well, this is a really gory wound. It's not a great thing. If it gets infected, that's going to be bad. But it was all to the hardest part of the skull. That's what the skull's there for. It's going to be okay. He just needs to maybe take it easy for a day or two. And there are two things here. The first thing is he might have been right in the immediate aftermath before we knew how the complications shook out. And the other thing is he's also a personal friend of Preston Brooks. It happened to be the doctor on hand was a friend of Brooks. So he's the person who ended up treating Sumner. So the thing is, Sumner, his wounds get infected. He has serious problems. He's physically debilitated. He has all the things you would expect of a blunt force trauma to the skull. Lots of headaches, difficulty sleeping, agitation. He probably suffered some kind of neurological damage, but we'll never know because, it was the 19th century. And he also has some pretty clear psychological wounds that shake out of this. He has flashbacks to the event. He exhibits it's always difficult to diagnose these things in the hindsight wise and knowing what we do now about psychology.
Right.
We should not always project this back. But by the same token, he's clearly messed up by this in some sense. He's probably suffering something like PTSD. He at first thinks he's going to be back in the Senate really soon, but it turns out he's not capable. He's barely able to get out of bed. He has a lot of trouble walking. He has very little stamina. Any kind of mental effort exhausts him very quickly. And Sumner will basically struggle with his recovery until 1859. He will spend most of that time, bar a brief effort to return to the Senate, convalescing at various spas, health resorts, consulting with doctors, and eventually over in Europe, trying to get away from it all and recover.
So 3 years.
And of course, years. He's not back till 1859. It's 1856 now. And the deal here is, of course, people who don't like Sumner assume that he's faking it. They think he's in this for the drama. Brooks never hit him that hard in the first place. He's playing for sympathy. Oh, poor Sumner. He got what was coming to him. Oh, boo-hoo,
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, he's actually privately suffering. Now, Brooks, on the other hand, is the subject of an investigation. What happens is, the day after the caning, the Senate convenes, and Henry Wilson immediately gets up and he says, okay, we need to have a committee. We need to investigate what happened and what we can do about it. Because this was a senator. This is one of us. This happened in our jurisdiction in the Senate. What can we do about Brooks? I call for an investigatory committee. Got to do something. But I will defer to elder, more experienced senators, because Wilson was kind of the new kid at the time. And he gives his speech, basically sits down, and the Senate goes dead silent. This is normally the point at which someone would second the motion, or yes, let's do that. Let's put it to a vote right now. Crickets. This goes on long enough. Eventually the presiding officer says, well, okay, next item of business. And then Seward stands up. Oh, wait a minute. That thing Wilson just said, we should do that. I mean, come on, guys. And the senators are kind of like, well, okay, but we're sure as hell not putting any Republicans on that committee. They vote a committee of 5, 0 Republicans. And they very quickly, they do a brief investigation. They agree on the essential facts. Yeah, Brooks came in. He pounded on Sumner's skull. It's about the speech. We agree with that. But there's a catch. The catch is that Brooks is a member of the House. The Senate does not have the power to discipline a member of the House. That is the exclusive power of the House. So the most we can do is send a note on to the House saying, hey guys, you want to take care of this? The House had not waited. The House, at this time has basically a northern majority that's sympathetic to Sumner. They already have a committee going, which produced a wonderful, lovely report that I've relied on very heavily. They question all the witnesses. They go on forth and do their due diligence and everything. The first person they question is Sumner himself. They go out to his boarding house room, and he's laying in bed. He gets up and he talks to them for a while. And they make a finding of fact that all the facts basically is laid out, and they recommend some courses of action. Number 1, the House should vote to expel Brooks. They should kick him right out. Number 2, Edmondson and Kite should be censured. Now, censure is a majority vote procedure which basically expresses the disapproval of the House. It is expected if you are censured, you will immediately resign your seat. This is the way things were done. So, of course, the debates immediately ensue between the people who think nothing wrong was done and the people who think this is a monstrous crime. And what eventually comes out after quite a bit of debating and wrangling is the House gets a majority together to expel Brooks, but not the 2/3 majority the Constitution requires. After that vote fails, Brooks stands up, gets recognized. He gives a brief speech, which he basically concludes by saying, "I am no longer a member of this Congress," and he walks right out. He resigned. Kite got the censure. He resigns. Edmondson managed to wriggle out. Now, the reason Kite got treated worse is when the actual caning went down, Kite was in the room. He saw it starting. He had his own cane, and he rushed forward. And he had Brooks's back. He was brandishing his cane about, saying, "Leave him be, leave him be," basically threatening anybody who tried to intervene. So Kite got the worst of that one. He's basically an accomplice at that point, even more so than Edmondson. Of course, the 2 South Carolinians resign and are immediately reelected.
Of course.
The only punishment that Brooks ever suffers is a $300 fine from a district court. That's all there is to it. Now, admittedly, that's $318.56, so that's more money than it is today. But still, he got off with a fine. Sumner's out for years because of this. I suppose, in a way, Sumner got the last laugh because within a year, Brooks is dead. He got sick and he died of something. We're not sure what. It's one of those, he was young, he got sick in the 19th century, he didn't make it. We don't know. But what happens here is, as far as Sumner goes, he's up for re-election in 1857. And there are some people in Massachusetts who are of a mind of, well, he's not going back to the Senate. It's no sense leaving his seat vacant. Why? I might fit in that seat very nicely, thank you. So there's some of this going on. But Sumner has a lot of friends in Massachusetts, and by getting a cane broken over his head, he has kind of achieved that celebrity star power he was hoping to get from his speeches. So he's practically a saint, at least in public. You know, people still dislike him for all kinds of reasons, but nobody's going to go openly against him after this horrible thing happened to him and while he's still convalescing. So Massachusetts actually reelects him. He's able enough to go very briefly and attends the Senate to vote on a tariff bill. But he's only there for a couple hours before he's completely debilitated, pounding headache, having a horrible time of it. And he basically retires then. He goes back to his boarding house, and he does not go back to the Senate. He goes back to his health spas to try to recover. Series of doctors, and eventually he ends up in Europe. But by suffering that, he got himself reelected essentially for life. He dies in office in the 1870s. Because he's Charles Sumner. He is Massachusetts now. You can't get around that. To turn on him politically after what happened would be like endorsing Brooks, saying he had the right thing to do in the first place. Now, in the bigger picture here, what you're looking at is a big divide in attitudes between the sections that has only really grown up over the course of the 19th century. To oversimplify it a lot, in the South, morals turn around the notion of honor. A man's reputation is everything, and he is expected to fiercely, violently defend it. This is not license for him to go against cherished mores of the community, but it does mean that an inability to control oneself in a lot of arenas is not a problem. Like, if Brooks literally lost his mind and just started wailing on Sumner for no reason at all because of this grievance, that would not have been a problem. Maybe not ideal, but acceptable. And the fact that he was willing to be fierce and unleashed is a testament to his manhood, his masculinity. He's a man's man for doing it. To not have done it, to have restrained himself, would have been womanish, emasculating. And this is more or less the traditional culture that used to apply in both sections, but it is something that the North, through various social changes, has gotten a lot away from. In the North, there's much more emphasis on self-control and restraint, being personally disciplined. It's not quite Puritan, but a self-control thing is just a huge part of it. To lose control of oneself, to lose one's reason, to give in to passion is now what's seen as lowering you and being, yes, because it's a horribly misogynistic time, womanish. Women are supposed to be sentimental. Men are supposed to be disciplined, rational, etc. It comes to the point that Northerners are outraged and they gather in these public meetings to protest what happened to Sumner. They are obviously furious. They're outraged. They're screaming at the speakers. They're booing at Brooks' name, hissing everything. They're cheering Sumner. It's an incredibly passionate thing with these packed rooms, thousands of people sometimes, hearing fiery speeches and go, yeah, more of that, more of that. We will not stand for this. They make a clear distinction, though. They are not angry. Believe me, they are not angry. What they are experiencing is indignation. Anger is a passionate, irrational response. Indignation is the rightful, sensible feeling outraged by a wrong suffered. Totally different.
I think what you've given us is to kind of show that this was just another event that led to the Civil War. And I guess in a sense, Sumner gets the ultimate final laugh because he survives until the end of the Civil War. He gets to see his victory played out.
Indeed, and the sweeping Civil Rights Act passed during Reconstruction was actually, Sumner had recently died, and the bill looked like it did not have the votes to pass. But basically, there were a few impassioned speeches at the very end, do this in memory of Sumner. And that was enough to just carry it over the top and give sweeping civil rights to the freed people. Politically, there's one other payoff for this. Remember way back I said it was unclear who was going to be the nation's second party. Was it going to be the Know-Nothings? Was it going to be the Republicans? Probably had the strength of feeling behind them because anti-slavery was a much more potent issue in itself than opposing immigration was at the time. But they had poor party organization. There was a lot more infighting going on. Whereas the Know-Nothings had been kind of a party for a little bit longer, and they had more built-in infrastructure. So we know how it worked out. But there's an argument made, and I think there's a little bit of truth to it. I'm not completely convinced, but I think it's a reasonable observation at least, that the news coming out of Kansas was bad, and it was pushing people in a more anti-slavery direction anyway. But the newspapers are all highly and openly partisan. So unless you go there yourself, you don't really know what happened. And having read territorial Kansas newspapers, I can tell you both sides are not above making things up. So there's a sense something's off kilter in Kansas. We all agree on that. But how much of what we're hearing is actually true and how much is propaganda? You can't really tell. But there's no dispute over what happened in Washington. Everybody agrees on that. Goodness sakes, a committee composed of Sumner's enemies agreed on that. It's in the open. It's in front of all the national reporters. There are reporters in the room when it happens. There are trusted congressmen, not nobodies who went out to the frontier to make their fortunes, but people they know back home. And here's Preston Brooks, who is showing them in the most graphic way possible, the most visceral way possible, the realization of everything that anti-slavery people have been trying to convince more moderate neighbors of for decades. People who are used to governing slaves through violence and force, people who are accustomed to that means of social control, will eventually use it on free white men too. They will spread their despotism throughout the country. And then literally, we will all be in Sumner's position. And we will have to accept that, or we have to take steps against it. And the step against it is the Republican Party, which almost won the election in 1856. Sumner got a few votes for vice president. He was not nominated, but he got a few sympathy votes. And then did win in 1860. And because the Republicans are the avowedly anti-slavery party, as the moment that they've been both waiting for, in a sense, and dreading, we now realize that in large numbers, it is probably no longer viable for us to remain within the Union and have slavery be secure. Therefore, slavery first, Union second. Secession, Civil War.
And I think that is the best possible note to leave it on, because Sumner really, in the end, sees his entire being vindicated, and this is just one episode that leads us to the eventual freedom of the slaves.
Yes, indeed it is. It's kind of odd that it's one that involves two white men getting in a fight, but that's how it worked out.
So I think you've given us a great, I guess, just riveting introduction. I've been sitting on the edge of my seat, like you barely even needed any guidance from me. But I undoubtedly bet there will be even more questions to follow. But we will have a thread and Ask Historians for people to come by, and hopefully you'll be able to answer some of those questions.
I'll be there.
So please, I ask any of you guys listening, if you have any questions, feel free to come and join us. And thank you very much for giving us this amazing account, Freedmen's Patrol.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.